I'm going to start today off with a bit of a disclaimer. I was really hoping I would never find myself in a position to make this video. I generally try to talk about parts of media that I like, but in this case, I think there is a substantially interesting conversation to be had about how something excellent can misstep so thoroughly. This is my second video on Darling in the Franxx, and since I already broke down the context for this show in the first one, I'm not going to do it again here. If you want the context, along with my more typical take on the first half of the series, then there's a link to it in the description. I was much more positive in that one than I'm about to be. There's going to be a lot of spoilers in this one. I mean, you probably shouldn't care, but if you do, now you know. So if you're still interested in what I have to say, here's the actual episode. In one of the earlier drafts of my first Darling in the Franxx video, I had a line at the end that I think is interesting to look at with the benefit of hindsight. Darling in the Franxx isn't over yet, and could very easily drop the ball in the final act. But even if it does, the people at Studio Trigger and A1 Pictures should really be commended for creating such a weird and different show that, despite its missteps here and there, manages to remain engaging throughout. That would have been the last line of the script, but I edited it out of the final product because I thought the sentence that preceded it was a stronger finish. But looking back at it now, I almost wish I had found a way to keep it in, because I was right to be worried about the ball being dropped in the final act. Studio Trigger's series has a bit of a problem with endings. Gurren Lagann is probably the least offensive in this regard, but even it is noticeably less engaging post-time skip. Meanwhile, the narratives of Kill la Kill, Gizniver, and unfortunately Darling in the Franxx as well, all start to disintegrate rapidly around the end of the second act. Darling in the Franxx is outstanding in how its second half fails to capture any of the solar essence that made most of the first 15 episodes so good. Fortunately, there's one aspect of the final episode that encapsulates enough of my issues with the series as a whole. I'm going to speak almost exclusively about it and how it's indicative of the overall quality of Darling in the Franxx post-episode 15 for the rest of this video. So let's take a look at what is, in my humble opinion, the most frustratingly incomprehensible scene in a series which seems to take the phrase frustratingly incomprehensible as its mission statement.
Naomi!
Alright, yeah, compared to some of the other stuff that happens in the exact same episode, this might seem like pretty small potatoes, but realistically, this 10-second scene that gets completely glossed over undercuts the entire plot of the show. Naomi, as you may remember, is protagonist Hiro's former partner and co-pilot who flunked out of the Parasite program. I bring up her backstory because the last time we actually saw her was all the way back in episode 1, where she literally says goodbye forever. She's brought up again several times in the first 15 episodes, the most notable of which is during episode 12, where she's heavily implied to be dead or otherwise disposed of. Her real purpose in the story is as a catalyst for Hiro's character arc, and as a useful reminder that whoever is in charge of this world has no use for children who can't pilot Franxx. She's also notable for being a major point of contrast to Hiro's new partner, 02, and she adequately serves her part in the central interpersonal relationship metaphor of the show. Bringing Naomi back to life in the final episode is the ultimate example of how out of touch the writers became with the point of Darling in the Franxx. Obviously, it causes a lot of narrative issues, the largest of which is how it undermines Hiro's base motivation as a character, along with making most of what he does for the first 6 episodes either pointless or unreasonable. But it's also indicative of the fact that either the writers didn't plan for the show to go on this long, or otherwise didn't care that they were diluting a tight, character-driven plot by taking what should have been background elements and making them the focus of large parts of the story. I'm inclined to call around half the episodes of Darling in the Franxx filler. That may seem odd, considering filler is characterized as plot points that don't advance the overall story, and just about every episode of Franxx has something big happening in it, but I'm of the opinion that the story here is about the relationships between the members of Squad 13, and everything involving the adults in the past is entirely or partially superfluous. If you remove the parts of Franxx about how the kids grow and change together, you're left with a less interesting rendition of Gurren Lagann, whereas if you remove the parts about APE and Verm, you get an actual story that's worth being told. So looking at it from that perspective, the story follows Hiro as he learns to stop being mopey all the time, thanks to 02, and 02 as she attempts to learn how to be human from Hiro and is gradually accepted by the rest of Squad 13. Throw in some side plots about the Ichigo, Goro, Hiro love triangle and the tension between Hiro, Mitsuru, and Zorome due to their differences in competence, and you've got the basic layout of the actual story of Franxx. The rest of it, however, is largely clutter that doesn't serve the story and is nowhere near as compelling. Problem here is that even with several episodes dedicated to stuff that's ultimately irrelevant to this plot, it's still almost entirely completed by the end of episode 15. 02 and Hiro have both grown as people and overcome their major character flaws, as have most of the minor characters. All that remains is to tie up a few loose ends here and there, and finish off some of the tertiary characters' personal arcs. But then, it keeps going, for 9 more episodes. And this is where Naomi still existing becomes a problem. What is the point of Naomi existing again? She never interacts with Hiro or 02, the two characters upon whom she'd have the most impact after returning to the show. The closest we get is a shot of her briefly staring at the mirror that's been left behind. And even that is never brought up again for any meaningful conversation. She just briefly looks at it, then we cut away, and she's suddenly gay because Ukuno needs to marry someone, and the only non-straight people were clones of Zero Two who died in space. So if her only purpose is to do something that literally any character could have done, and could have done without undercutting the protagonist's motivation, why is she here? Now, imagine, for a second, that instead of Naomi, I was just talking about the entire second half of Franxx. If all it does is indulge in higher and higher scale conflict without creating higher stakes, and without changing any of the involved characters in any way, and without even referencing the metaphors and themes of the show that are established so obviously and frequently in the first half, why does it exist? I'm of the opinion that you should only tell a story that you feel needs to be told. So, if you don't have a strong reason to tell the story, don't bother telling it at all. Darling in the Franxx has a story that is really worth telling. But the problem is that it's surrounded by a bunch of waste that isn't worth watching, let alone writing. I still really love parts of Franxx, and I don't begrudge anyone who still legitimately enjoys its second half. I'm just very disappointed that it ended up being an absolute waste of potential. Trigger has made 4 attempts at conveying what is effectively the same idea, and honestly my patience for them is starting to wear a bit thin. I thought maybe 4th time's the charm for them when it comes to telling the story, but it seems like the ending has only gotten worse over time. I do really hope that one day they'll stick the landing, but after the letdown that was Darling in the Franxx, my excitement for Promare and their other future projects just isn't what it once was.